everyone, to our ThinkStep webinar. I'm Emily. I'm from the client engagement team, and I'm really excited to be presenting this to you today, hosted by Nicky and Greg from Moose Toys, as we talk about science-based targets and how Moose Toys developed their own targets and how we help with validating them in that process. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Greg Simmons, who's the Director of Sustainable Product Development at Moose Toys. He's going to talk through Moose Toys 2040 targets and how SBTi helped them to realize these. So Greg, take it away.
Hey, Emily, thank you very much. Great to be here this morning. And Nicky, it's going to be awesome to have the opportunity to discuss sustainability and our net zero journey, how ThinkStep have helped us out with you. So probably just to start, Moose has been on a sustainability journey for around about probably 4 to 5 years now. And when we first started, it wasn't really structured. You sort of got to find your way in. And now we think that we're getting a little bit better at it. We're able to define all of our sustainability functions under one of these 3 pillars. And we kind of work on the principle is that if we can't find a home with it under these 3 principles, then we can't really define it well enough, so we shouldn't do it. The first sustainability pillar is mission zero, and that's the goal for us to be a net zero company by 2040. As a toy company, that's a pretty big challenge, but Moose as a business, we're in the habit of setting big, hairy, audacious goals, and this is one of them for us. The second sustainability pillar is project circularity, and this is to look at how we can reduce the environmental impact of our products, our packaging, and our operations. And the third, which is a relatively new pillar for us, is environmental regeneration. And this looks into how we can invest back into nature and replace what we take out. And a good example of this, we use quite a lot of paper and cardboard within our packaging. Approximately 70+% of that is actually all recycled fiber, but you've got that other 25 to 30%, which is virgin. And so what we're looking to do is say, how can we actually reforest, a proportion of that moving forwards? And sustainability is important to Moose, and that's why we have created these 3 pillars. Now, if we were thinking about our actual net zero journey, we would have struggled if we didn't have the assistance of ThinkStep. In the early days, when we were trying to work out exactly how we were going to do it, to be able to find a partner like ThinkStep has been great to hold our hands through the whole process. And the first, significant milestone within trying to realize a net zero goal is setting a science-based targets. And earlier this year, we had our science-based target validated, and that was with the help of the whole team at ThinkStep. It represented about almost 2.5 years of work up to that point. Now, the next step on that journey is reporting these emissions. And now we are, like a lot of Australian companies, we are now going to be legally required to measure and report our emissions. And this includes emissions of our supply chain partners. So sustainability has gone beyond being a nice to have or something, a personal ambition for a business. It's now a fundamental legal requirement. But this pull for information on our emissions doesn't just come from government that's interested in medium to large companies. The other pull that we get is from our customers and licensors. So we are required to report our emissions at the request of these two different groups, and we report into a carbon disclosure project. And so really for us now, these are big steps for us as a business, especially being privately owned. But one thing is for certain, that if we want to unlock further sustainability improvements, the next component of that is supply chain collaboration. So that's our sort of net zero journey in a nutshell there, Nicky.
Thanks, Greg. So just as an introduction, I'm Nicky. I am Principal Sustainability Specialist at thinkstep-anz, and I had the pleasure of working with Greg over a number of years now. As he said, we first started out by helping them build their first carbon inventory, and worked alongside them in developing that science-based target and getting it validated. And so, yes, it's been really great working with Greg and his team, because they were all really highly engaged in the process, and they have the support of the top level of their business in making this happen, which is really essential if you're going to take on a project like this, is to have full support from the business. So now I thought, as a bit of a follow-on from what Greg was talking about, I thought this audience might be really interested in understanding a bit about what's going to change with science-based targets, because if you are in the process of setting your first target, then you will need to consider the latest changes that are coming that have not yet arrived, but that will be coming from the science-based targets. So currently there is this draft consultation of the corporate net zero standard 2.0. And this is the proposed changes to the original 1.2 corporate net zero standard that currently exists. So if you, in this current year, were thinking about setting a science-based target, you would still be using the 1.2, but given the changes that are coming, you probably want to keep an eye on what's happening and what's coming, because this will come and apply to you in future years when you go to revalidate your targets. So firstly, just a little bit about why they're doing this. And this message here is from the Science-Based Targets Initiative. They said basically, since the corporate net zero standard was first published, it's become increasingly clear that time is running out to tackle climate change. 2024 was the hottest year in recorded history. The latest climate science provides us with a better understanding of the necessary steps needed to curb temperature rises and mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And therefore, they have produced this new 2.0 standard to try to not only increase ambition, but make the entire process more robust, more steps in place to ensure that not only people setting really clear, very ambitious targets, but also the monitoring of that target ongoing to ensure that they are actually going to meet it and are tracking progress towards those targets. So I thought I'd just touch a bit on some of the key changes. This is not a complete listing of everything that's changing, but some of the big ones. And also keep in mind that as this is a draft, all of these things could change, but this is the initial proposal. So in version 1.2, you were able to set one combined scope 1 and 2 target. You didn't have to, you can set separate ones, but the option was there. The version 2.0 will require you to separate out scope 1 and 2. And the reason for this is the SBTi are trying to address the challenges with unbundled renewable energy certificates, which might mask the lack of reductions that is happening in scope 1, meaning you could buy renewable energy certificates for all of your scope 2, and that reduction alone could be enough to meet your target, and therefore you don't even need to really go into scope 1. This will not be possible in version 2.0 because you have to have your own target for what you're going to do in scope 1 alone. In version 1.2, you could set a scope 2 target based on market-based or location-based emissions, again meaning that you could use renewable energy certificates to reduce your emissions if you were using the market-based approach. But in the latest version, you now need to set both a location-based scope 2 target and a market-based approach, which means you can use the renewable energy certificates to help address your market-based target, but you also need to be reducing your location-based emissions, meaning you need to become more efficient, or you need to be sourcing your own renewable energy, such as developing your own solar or wind sources and like direct sourcing of renewable energy rather than using it from a market-based mechanism. And as well, you have to do it faster. So scope 2, in the past, you could set your target up to 2050. Now scope 2 targets must be achieved by 2040. So they're recognizing that these changes need to happen sooner in order for us to stay within this 1.5 degree world. Companies in the past, or in the current, more accurately, could set or needed to set a scope 3 target if the scope 3 emissions were greater than 40% of total company emissions. Now, in our experience, that was pretty much everyone anyway, because scope 3 tends to be one of your largest source of emissions against scope 1 and 2, but there was that option that if you had a heavy scope 1 and 2, you didn't necessarily need to set a scope 3 target. In version 2.0, if you are a category A company, and in New Zealand and Australia, large and medium-sized companies category A, you would need a scope 3 target regardless of how significant your scope 3 emissions are against your total emissions. In the current version, you could choose your emissions that were included within the target boundary as long as they covered 67% of your scope 3 total inventory in your near-term targets and must cover 90% within the net zero target. Now they're not just sort of giving you that option of picking and choosing as long as you have that percentage coverage. You must now also consider what are your most emission intensive sources and the areas where your company has the most influence to improve or reduce those emissions. So in a lot of cases, that might be your tier 1 suppliers where you have direct influence. In version 1.2, there are 3 main target setting methods. You can either have an absolute reduction target, this is for scope 3 specifically, emissions intensity, or supplier engagement. In the new standards, they're really recognizing that scope 3 is incredibly challenging. There is this issue of how much can you influence, what can you do to both collect that primary data, and therefore that introducing some more alignment target options. And this is things such as focusing on the percentage of your procurement from net zero aligned suppliers, or your share of revenue that's been derived from net zero aligned products and services. So new options to try to make sure that you are addressing scope 3 without it being like an absolute emission reduction target, which can be challenging until you have primary data that you can use to measure those emissions. And then just some other considerations to be aware of, things that they are proposing to introduce into version 2.1 is a 5-year validation cycle, which means that you will review and set new targets every 5 years, and you will also be required to report your progress against the current targets at that 5-year validation cycle. You need to disclose a transition plan, meaning how do you intend to achieve that target that you have set. In the past, there had been requests to provide some evidence of what it was you were thinking of doing in order to achieve the target, but not really robust transition plans. So there's a higher expectation for you to really articulate what it is you're going to do to achieve the target that you have set, and then disclose that publicly. And you must, at a minimum, have limited assurance required for your base year emissions and your target year emissions, so that we're really clear that you have had someone external, third party, confirm the accuracy and completeness of the inventory that you have developed. And so all of this is aimed to be finalized and starting to have targets set against version 2.0 by 2027. That is the current aim. It's currently going through a feedback process at the moment where people can provide their thoughts on whether or not these changes make sense or if anything else needs to change. So we will continue to monitor this space to see what else might happen and what might change. But I think for anybody who's currently looking at science-based targets, keep in mind you are still able to use the rules of version 1.2, but you should always keep an eye on what's happening in 2.0 because it's not that far away. Thanks. I'll hand it back to Emily.
Awesome. Thanks, Nikki. It's great to see what we can expect to see from that standard going forward. This brings us to the Q&A section of this webinar. So our first question is, what are the percentage reductions for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for Moose Toys to meet SBTi? So Greg, are you able to speak to that?
Could you just repeat that question for us?
Yeah, no worries. So this is about the percentage reductions for your carbon emissions across scope 1, 2, and 3 to meet your targets. I'm not sure if you've got that information off the top of your head or if you need to go back and update later.
So we would have to update later, but we have to engage with a minimum, I think it's about 69% of our entire supply chain to meet our near-term targets, and we have to get that 69% to set a science-aligned emissions reduction target as well. In our near-term targets, we also have, I think for us, a minimum of 42%, I think is the renewable energy target. Though us as a business, we focus actually on moving all our owned and operated offices over to 100% before the 2029, I think is our deadline on that. And definitely, if anybody's interested, you can go on the Science Based Targets website and search for Moose Toys. The exact wording of our validated targets is included and published there.
Perfect. Thanks, Greg. Yes, so if anyone wants to see the details of those SBTIs, they are publicly available. So that's awesome. Another question. So does a new location-based renewable energy generation allow to be fed into the grid? Nikki or Greg, if either of you would like to take a stab at that one.
I can attempt it. So yeah, if you are generating your own renewable energy, then you could, in theory, use any additional of that renewable energy feeder back into the grid, but that wouldn't affect your own emission reductions because you can't claim that additional renewable energy. You have to talk about, you've got it is complicated, and we might need to come back to you just to get more specific, but the renewable energy that you are both using and, generating and using yourself would go into your own GHG inventory, but then what is fed into the grid would have to consider how that would be incorporated, but I don't think that would work as an emission reduction for yourself because it would be claimed by those who end up using that renewable energy from the grid and might possibly be working under some other type of renewable energy certificate, like a contractual method, but it wouldn't feed into your own inventory would be my understanding, but I can double check to make sure that that is correct.
Awesome. Thanks, Nick. Another question here, Nikki, this one's possibly for you. Are there any plans to make science-based targets compulsory?
I think that would be a country by country decision of whether or not they would make it a regulated thing that they would have to do it. And obviously in Australia and New Zealand, we now have climate related disclosures, and those disclosures require companies to set targets. But at this stage, neither country has said that those have to be science-based targets. But we would expect over time that they will become higher and higher standards about what is expected in a target. And we know that science-based targets have always been seen as best practice of the most robust and most aligned to the 1.5 degree world of the Paris Climate Agreement. And therefore, in theory, they may push for that, but it's also really challenging for a lot of companies due to certain exceptions within their company of being able to set a science-based target. So whether or not they would make that mandatory, it's hard to say, but there's nothing to indicate right now that they do, and either speaking specifically of Australia and New Zealand, that it's required that it would be a science-based target through the Science-Based Target Initiative.
Awesome. We have another question about just setting targets in general. So, Nikki, I might throw to you, and then Greg, if you want to speak to your own experience with setting targets outside of SBT, that would be really useful. So, Nikki, what are your thoughts on setting/publishing targets that aren't science-based specifically?
Yeah, we do work with clients where we set targets that aren't science-based. There often are reasons why a company may choose not to use the Science-Based Targets Initiative and go down the path of validating that target. There are sometimes certain reasons in their company why it's very challenging to do so and to meet all of the rules. As I mentioned before, things like being able to access primary data for your Scope 3 can be quite a big challenge. And now there are some other alternative methods. Greg and Moose Toys have gone down that supplier engagement target route as well to take that first step in getting better data. You can set that supplier engagement target instead of an actual emissions reduction target, and that can be a workaround. But we do also work with a lot of clients where we just use the Science-Based Targets Initiatives and their guidelines to try to create a robust target, but it's one that we wouldn't recommend trying to validate with them because there might be exceptions as to why it is not science-based, and we would call that science-aligned. And for full disclosure, it would be best when describing your target as science-aligned to discuss sort of the main reasons where it maybe doesn't align with the standards. So the potential limitations as to why you felt that an actual validated target wasn't the right choice at that time. So it really depends on the company and what challenges. For example, in New Zealand, electricity generation here in New Zealand and the transmission and distribution losses is really challenging area where they find it's quite difficult to fit within the rules of the current Science-Based Targets Initiative. So they, in a lot of cases, would choose not to set that type of target because they know it's not going to be possible to achieve, and you don't want to set a target that you can't achieve because then you have to backtrack later. So you want to know at the stage of setting a target that you have an idea of how it'll be achieved. And in this latest version 2.0, it can't just be an idea. You have to have a full transition plan to explain exactly how you plan to get to those reductions. Greg, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, the working out the pathway, which way go for us, it was definitely the supplier engagement because of the distortion in our carbon footprint. So we learned this after, going through that process with you guys to understand exactly what our carbon footprint looks like and that its distribution between 1s, 2s and 3s. And from there, it actually completely was clear that the way for us was going through that supplier engagement process. And I think there's huge benefits that this brings about as well, is that that relationship that we have as I say, as a customer, and then you've got our OEMs that are suppliers to us. Instead of just having that sort of very formal business-like arrangement, we're now starting to work closer and closer. A lot of our OEMs have been with us for over 2 decades. And this is, we see as an opportunity to collaborate and also work closer together, understand more about each other's, what they can actually deliver through our supply chain. I think for us, because of the nature, we have such a large amount in scope 3, and the nature that we manufacture in the Far East, and we have a lot of our big markets in the West, that supply chain engagement piece and the direction to go, that was very clear from the off.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you both for that. That's very, very in-depth answer for that small question. So that's really awesome. We've got time for one more. So we've got this one from Tim, and perhaps this is something that both of you can have input on again. So Tim says, agree that companies should do their best to reduce energy consumption, but it may be inefficient for a company to develop their own generation. Is it acceptable to have a target of 0 market-based emissions, but a non-zero target for location-based emissions? So Nicky, I might start with you. That sounds like that's almost related to the new standard coming out.
Yeah. So obviously that location-based net zero is going to be the hardest one to achieve, because you can't use those market-based mechanisms. It doesn't have to be just your own generation to be able to achieve that location-based one. It can be also your direct sourcing of renewable energy. So someone else can own the infrastructure, but you are directly sourcing it. You're not using a market-based mechanism where you're basically buying certificates that say that you have purchased a renewable portion of an overall energy supply. You're actually going out and sourcing energy from, like a wind farm or something like that. So you are absolutely certain that the energy that you are sourcing is coming directly from a renewable energy source. If it's not possible to create your own energy, again, you can also do your emission efficiencies, but your energy efficiencies. You're never going to, completely reduce all need for electricity, obviously. If you're going to use the version 2.0 standards, I guess the short answer is no, you can't have a non-zero target if you want to follow their rules, because that's the rules that they've established. But keep in mind, it's not 0, it's net zero, which means 90% reduction. And then there's another 10% allowance where you can have, offsetting agreements, because they recognize that there will be a residual amount that cannot be reduced down to 0. But still 90% is a big ask. So yeah, you'll have to, and I think it'll become more apparent once the version 2.0 comes out. There'll be more guidance coming that'll help us understand sort of what alternative options they're suggesting to achieve that target, because it is a pretty challenging one, because most people to date had been considering market-based, using certificates, power purchase agreements, and things like that would be enough to get that target across the line, and now that they're changing the goalpost a little bit to push for even more. And so we'll continue to sort of watch the space on what people will do to try to achieve that one.
Great, thanks, Nicky. That's all our questions, and we are at time. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining the webinar. Before we wrap up, we've got a few really exciting upcoming things as well. So we're launching our updated spend-based emission factors this Thursday. So if you haven't registered for that webinar already, and you want to learn how these new emission factors work, you can register on our website. We have a new webinar, which is not yet open for registration, but will be very shortly, about the work that we did for ASBEC, so the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council, and how we supported with a roadmap for decarbonising that sector. We also have a new course, so an applied LCA course, and this will be really useful for those who already have an LCA or an EPD and want to know how to make the most of it. So these courses are in person in Melbourne and Sydney, and there's more information on our website about those. And if you're based in a location outside of them, please let us know, and we'll keep that interest in mind and hopefully be able to run a course in an area near you. We also have a masterclass. So this one's online. We've run 2 of these already, and this is the 3rd installment, just going through how you can steer clear of greenwashing and how you can ensure that your communications are telling the truth about your product and don't land you in hot water with your customers. So, or regulatory bodies for that matter. So that's not one to miss either, and that's in October. So plenty of time for you to register for that one. Perfect. All right. Well, with that being said, thank you so much, Greg and Nicky, for coming onto this webinar. It's great to see the work that Moose Toys is doing in this space, and have a great rest of your afternoon.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Em. Thanks, Nicky.
We have many more webinar replays on a whole host of sustainability topics. You can check them out on our website and our YouTube channel.